I never meant to be anything to them. That's the part nobody believes when I tell it now. They hear the story and they picture some kind of chosen one, a woman who walked into a den of apex predators and tamed them with kindness and patience. That's not what happened. What happened was messier, louder, and smelled considerably worse, and the kindness had nothing to do with it. What it had to do with was the fact that I was the only person on Waypoint Kessara who did not run. Let me start from the beginning, because the beginning matters. I am a xenobiological field handler. That's the polite title. What it means in practice is that I go to places where alien fauna have become a problem for human or allied operations. I assess the situation, and I make recommendations. Sometimes I implement those recommendations myself. I have been bitten by 6 distinct species, stung by 2, and on one memorable occasion in the outer reaches, I was briefly swallowed by something that did not have a name yet and had to be cut out. I tell you this not to impress you, but because you need to understand that when I say something scared me, you should take it seriously. The Veth scared me. They are not the largest predators in the known territories. They are not the fastest, not the most venomous, not the most armored. What they are is coordinated. A single Veth standing in a doorway is alarming. They average 2.5 meters. Their forelimbs end in articulated claws designed for gripping and tearing. Their visual processing runs on motion detection overlaid with thermal mapping, and they communicate through subsonic resonance that you feel in your back teeth before you hear it with your ears. A single Veth is alarming. A pack of Veth, operating in concert, running coordinated tactics as naturally as breathing, that is something else entirely. The Accord had ended the active phase of the Veth territorial expansion 8 months before the day I arrived at Kessara. Ended is a generous word. Paused is more accurate. Both sides had bled enough that continuing immediately seemed inconvenient, so they signed documents and called it peace and went home to count their dead. Kessara was one of 3 neutral waypoints agreed upon as transit hubs. Ships from either side could dock, resupply, move on. The theory was that commerce and proximity would eventually soften things. The theory was authored by people who had never stood in a room with a Veth. I was at Kessara because a Veth transport had gone down in the docking approach 2 weeks earlier. Mechanical failure, no weapons fire involved, just bad luck and worse engineering. The adult crew had not survived the crash. What had survived were 8 Veth juveniles, War-Caste, which means they had been bred specifically for combat roles, which means even as juveniles they were operating on instincts that had been refined over 10 generations of selection pressure for aggression, pack coordination, and threat response. The station security team had sealed them in the crash section and called for specialists. The first specialist they called had refused the job. The second had taken one look through the viewport at 8 pairs of thermal eyes tracking movement in the dark and had also refused the job. I was the third call. I said yes, because that's what I do, and because the briefing mentioned that the eldest of the 8 was bleeding from a shrapnel wound that hadn't been treated, and something about that detail stuck in my throat in a way I couldn't ignore. When I arrived, Station Commander Oral met me at the docking bay with the expression of a man who has been sleeping poorly for 2 weeks and has begun to wonder if he will ever sleep well again. "They killed the maintenance drone we sent in," he said, "tore it apart in about 4 seconds. Were they threatened by it? It was trying to clean the floor. Motion triggers their response pattern," I said. "Fast movement, erratic movement, especially from something low to the ground. It looked like prey or it looked like an attack vector. Either way, correct response from their perspective." Oral looked at me as though I had said something in a language he didn't speak. "They're juveniles," he said. "War-Caste juveniles," I said. "The distinction matters." He walked me to the sealed section. The door was a heavy blast door, rated for pressure events, which told me the security team had been taking this seriously from the start. Through the small reinforced viewport, I could see the interior of the crash transport's forward hold, dim emergency lighting, debris from the impact, and 8 shapes arranged in a loose formation near the far wall. They were watching the door. Not milling, not packing, watching, in formation. The largest one I estimated maybe 18 months old, which for a war-caste Veth means roughly the cognitive and physical equivalent of a 12-year-old human who has been training with the military since birth, was positioned slightly forward of the others. The wounded one I saw was tucked into the center of the group. The others had arranged themselves around it without any visible coordination that I could detect. They had just done it, the way a flock shifts, the way a school of fish turns all at once as one, because that's how they think. "How long has the wound gone untreated?" I asked. "Since the crash," Oral said. 2 weeks, I kept my voice level. "What have you been feeding them?" A pause that told me everything. "We've been passing rations through the slot at the base of the door." "Have they eaten?" "Some, not consistently." "Stressed juveniles won't eat," I said. "Especially not unfamiliar food, especially not when they can't verify it isn't a threat." The wound and the food situation together were running out of time on this. Running out of time for what? For them surviving long enough to be anyone's problem other than ours. Oral looked at me. "You're going in there." It wasn't a question, but I answered it anyway. "Yes." "Our security team won't go in with you." "I know. I wouldn't want them to. Fast movement, weapons, body armor, everything in their threat response library. Send them in and we'd have a firefight that none of the cubs would survive." I paused. "Do you have medical supplies? Not station standard. I need analgesic compounds that are safe for Veth physiology, wound sealant, and something to drink that isn't water. They're dehydrated. Electrolytes in a format they can smell that isn't foreign to their diet." "I can try," Oral said. "Don't try, get it." He went to get it. I spent 40 minutes outside the door before I went in. This is the part that people gloss over when they retell the story, and it's the part that mattered most. I stood at the viewport and I let them look at me. That was it. I stood still, hands at my sides, no sudden movements, and I looked back at them and I let time pass. Slow movements to predators who hunt by motion signal one of two things. They signal something sick, which triggers prey response, or they signal something that is not afraid, which triggers a different kind of attention entirely. I was betting on the second. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't afraid. My heart was doing things hearts are not supposed to do for extended periods. But fear, in my line of work, is a condition you manage rather than eliminate. And managing it means keeping your hands still and your face neutral and not letting your body transmit what your nervous system is experiencing. At the 30-minute mark, one of the smaller cubs, third or fourth from the right in the formation, shifted its weight. Not toward me, just shifted. A micro-adjustment. Curiosity, probably. The threat calculus running through whatever war-caste juveniles use for a decision-making process had apparently come up with something other than full hostility. At 40 minutes, I picked up the medical supplies Oral had brought and I keyed the door. The blast door opened slowly. I had asked Oral to set the opening speed to minimum, the slowest the mechanism could manage, and to kill the overhead lights in the hold before I entered, leaving only the emergency strips along the floor. Low light, slow movement, no sudden sound. I had also asked him to wait outside and not to speak to me once I crossed the threshold, regardless of what he heard or didn't hear for the next however long it took. He had looked at me like I was writing my own obituary. I walked in. 8 pairs of thermal eyes tracked me from the far wall. The subsonic resonance hit me immediately, low, complex, layered, the kind of sound that isn't quite sound and communicates more than language can translate. My best reading of it was something between warning and assessment. They weren't sure what I was yet. I stopped 6 meters inside the door and sat down on the floor. Not crouched. Not kneeling, fully sat cross-legged, which put my eye level below the midpoint of the pack's formation and removed most of my vertical threat profile. I set the supplies beside me. I did not look directly at the large one, the one positioned forward. Sustained direct eye contact with Veth reads as challenge. I looked slightly past them, at a point on the far wall, and I waited. Nothing happened for a long time. Then the large one made a sound. Short, sharp, ascending pitch, a query in the range I'd read in the briefing materials. It was asking something of the others, or of me, or of the situation. I didn't try to answer it. I'm not Veth. I was not going to insult 8 war-caste juveniles by pretending I spoke their language after 2 weeks. What I did was stay still. The wounded one, tucked in the center, made a different sound. Quieter. Almost involuntary, the way a sound escapes when pain resets itself at a new baseline. I moved then, slowly. I picked up the medical kit, opened it with deliberate, visible movements, and I looked at the wounded one directly for the first time. Not a challenge look, the kind of look you use when you're communicating intention. I held up the wound sealant where they could see it, then I set it back down, then I set my hands in my lap. More time. Then the large one stepped forward. 1 step, stopped. I did not move. Another step. By the time it was 2 meters from me, I could smell them properly. The particular sharp musk of Veth War-Caste. Something like iron and something like ozone and something underneath that I can only describe as intentional. A scent that communicates pack status and readiness in ways that human noses can only partially decode. It stood over me, and it was massive, even for a juvenile. The shoulder was at my eye level while I was sitting, which meant fully upright it had nearly a meter on me. The forelimb claws, even retracted, were visible as ridged edges under the covering membrane. It looked down at me for what was probably 15 seconds, and felt like significantly longer. Then it made a sound I recognized from my briefing materials only in the loosest terms. The notation in the xenobiology records described it as a contact call, used between pack members during non-threatening proximity. The closest functional translation the researchers had managed was something like, established. I exhaled slowly. I'm going to help the hurt one, I said, quiet, steady, not a whisper and not a command. I'm going to stay slow, you can stop me anytime. I don't think it understood the words. I think it understood the tone, the pace, the fact that I didn't stand up. I reached for the supplies and I moved toward the wounded cub, and the large one walked beside me, and the others shifted as I moved through them, and none of them attacked. What I found when I got to the wounded one was worse than the report had indicated. The shrapnel wound in the upper flank had begun to close over dirty, which is as bad as it sounds. It was infected. The cub, the smallest of the 8, I noted, probably the youngest, was running a fever I could feel through my gloves when I rested my hand near the wound site. It was looking at me with the flat, exhausted focus of something that has been in pain too long to react to new stimuli with anything beyond an assessment. I worked slowly and I talked while I worked, not to explain myself to them, just because silence in that room was heavy and voice seemed to fill it in a way that was tolerated. I talked about nothing, about the supply run I'd taken before the assignment, about the atmospheric composition of Kessara's dock ring, about the particular engineering failure mode that had brought their transport down, which I didn't actually know but theorized aloud as I cleaned the wound. The cubs settled around me as I worked, not all the way down, not sleeping, alert, but their postures had shifted from the tight formation at the wall to something looser, distributed, a different kind of arrangement that I recognized from the research literature as a resting watch pattern. They were watching over me while I worked on one of them. I didn't let myself feel too much about that until later. It took 6 hours the first day. I came back the next day, and the day after, and every day for 11 days. The wounded cub's infection cleared on day 4, which was when I allowed myself to believe it was going to survive. By day 6, the others had started approaching me when I arrived rather than waiting for me to sit. Not rushing, not aggressive, just moving to intercept and then falling into pace beside me, which in Veth body language apparently translates to an escort or an honor guard, depending on context. I was not sure which. Probably the distinction didn't matter as much as the fact that they were doing it at all. Oral watched all of this through the viewport cameras and said very little to me directly, which I appreciated. His security team watched the cameras too. The word got around the station. There's always a point where the word gets around, and by day 8 I was aware that people were stopping by the camera feeds when their shifts allowed, watching this strange thing that was happening in the sealed hold. The strange thing, stated plainly, was that 8 War-Caste Veth juveniles had decided I was Pac. I'm careful with that word because the research literature is careful with it, and because I didn't and still don't want to project human emotional frameworks onto something I can only understand from the outside. But there's a specific set of behaviors that the xenobiology records describe as Pac integration indicators, and by day 9, the cubs were exhibiting most of them, following my movement patterns, orienting toward me in the resting watch formation. The large one, I had started thinking of it as first, because it was always first, and because nomming things is a human habit I can't entirely suppress, had taken to sitting beside me when I did my daily assessment rounds, not quite close enough to touch, but in a proximity that communicated something the literature called anchor presence, a pack member whose location defines the group's center of gravity. On day 11, I brought this to Oral. "We have a problem," I said. He leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man being handed a problem he already suspected was coming. "Tell me." "The Accord's Veth liaison sent a communication this morning," I said. "Accord enforcement is sending a reclamation team. They want the cubs." That should be good news," Oral said carefully. "The reclamation team is an enforcement unit," I said. "Not a rescue unit, not a welfare team. Their mandate is to secure and transport. The cubs are War-Caste. In Veth society, War-Caste juveniles who have been isolated and then integrated with a non-Veth pack structure are—" I stopped. "The literature describes it as contaminated. The Accord's position on contaminated War-Caste is not on record because the situation has never formally arisen before." Oral was very still. "What does not on record mean in practical terms?" "It means I don't know what they'll do when they get here. And I don't think the cubs are going to understand what's happening when a group of adult Veth enforcement officers arrives to separate them from their current pack structure, which is me." "When do they arrive?" 36 hours. He looked at the camera feed. The cubs were visible in the hold, spread in their resting watch pattern, several of them tracking the camera with the idle focus they'd started giving to things they'd assessed as non-threatening. First was in the anchor position near the center. "What do you recommend?" Oral asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "But I'm going back in there and I'm going to spend tonight with them and I'm going to think." I went back in. I brought food, real food, not ration packets. I'd managed to source protein stocks compatible with Veth dietary needs through the station's supply officer, who had been watching the camera feeds and was apparently willing to move procurement heaven and earth to help. I brought it in and I distributed it and I sat in the middle of them while they ate, and first sat beside me, and the youngest one, I had started thinking of it as eighth, crawled into my peripheral space and went to sleep with its head not quite touching my knee. I thought. The problem was this. The enforcement team was going to arrive with authority, weapons, and the legal weight of the Accord behind them. They were going to enter the hold. The cubs were going to read that entry the way they had read every entry since the crash, threat assessment, formation, wait-and-see, except that this time the things entering were going to be adult Veth, which meant a completely different set of threat response protocols. Because adult Veth entering a juvenile pack space without pack sanction reads as dominance challenge. The cubs would fight. The enforcement team would respond. 8 juveniles against a trained adult enforcement unit was not a fight I wanted to see the conclusion of. There was a solution, and I didn't like it, which usually means it's the right one. I could be present when the enforcement team entered. Not hidden in the corner, not observing from outside present. Pack. In the anchor position, in the center of the formation, in the place that first had been assigning me for 5 days without my asking. If the Cubs saw me as Pack, and if they read my response to the enforcement team's entrance as non-threatening, the odds of them holding the formation rather than breaking to attack were not good, but better. Better than the alternative. But it required the enforcement team to understand what was happening, and to not do anything stupid in the first 30 seconds, which was where the plan got fragile, because I had 36 hours to brief a Veth enforcement unit on the nuances of what had happened in this hold over the past 11 days, through the Accord's interpretation service, without them concluding I was either delusional or dangerous. I sat there in the dark with 8 alien predators arranged around me, and I worked out what I was going to say. The enforcement team arrived in 29 hours, not 36. I was in the hold when the station systems announced their docking. I felt the Cubs register it before the announcement finished, a shift in the resonance, a tightening of the pattern, first moving from the resting position to upright in a single fluid motion that was very fast and very quiet. "Stay here," I said. I said it to myself as much as to them. Or maybe it was the other way around. I said it and I stayed seated, deliberately, visibly in the anchor position. I did not move toward the door. First looked at me. Then first looked at the door. Then one by one, starting from the largest and moving outward, the Cubs arranged themselves. Not the resting watch pattern, not the loose distribution they'd been using around me. They formed something I recognized from the combat documentation in my briefing materials, something I had read about and noted and hoped I would never see at close range. A defensive perimeter, concentric, staggered, with the center position protected and the outermost ring facing outward. They put me in the center. 8 war-caste Veth juveniles, responding to 2 words spoken in a language none of them understood, had formed a defensive perimeter around a human woman who hadn't asked them to, and hadn't trained them to, and had, 11 days ago, sat down on a dirty floor and stayed still until they decided she was worth tolerating. I will not pretend I didn't feel something very large and very complicated in that moment. I will say that I kept it off my face, because what was coming through the door required me to be steady, and because the Cubs were reading me and I needed them reading steady, and because there is a time for whatever that feeling was, and it was not then. The blast door opened. 4 of them, enforcement officers, adult Veth, full kit, body armor in the Accord's markings, sensor equipment, restraint apparatus. The largest was nearly a full head taller than first had been when it stood over me on my first day, which tells you something about the difference between juvenile and adult war-caste. They came through the door and they stopped. They had stopped because of the formation. I could see them processing it, 4 sets of thermal eyes sweeping the room, and what they were seeing was 8 juveniles in a combat perimeter with a human in the middle, which is not, by any account, a thing that had ever appeared in their operational briefings. The lead officer, I could tell by the kit designation, additional sensor array on the collar, made a sound. It was subsonic, complex, the kind of resonance I'd been swimming in for 11 days. I couldn't translate it, but the effect on the Cubs was immediate. First's response was a single short burst, flat in pitch, and the perimeter held. The lead officer made another sound, longer this time. First made the same flat response. The lead officer looked at me. I had been prepared for this moment, and I was still not prepared for it. Standing still in the center of a war-caste perimeter, while 4 armed adult Veth enforcement officers pointed their sensor equipment at you, is a specific experience that I cannot fully recommend. My briefing from the station's interpretation service had been 30 hours long, and had covered every scenario I could think of except the exact one I was now in. "I am Marin Solis," I said, steady and slow and clear. "Field handler, xenobiological service. I have been caring for these juveniles for 11 days. I paused, giving the interpretation system time to work. Oral had patched it into the hold's communications as I'd requested. I am pack bonded to them under conditions I did not initiate and did not engineer. I am asking you to proceed slowly and let me manage the transition. The interpretation system did whatever interpretation systems do. The lead officer received the translation. There was a long moment. The lead officer looked at First. First was watching the officer with the steady, unblinking attention of something that has done its threat assessment and reached a conclusion that it will act on if necessary. The rest of the perimeter was the same, a held breath, the kind of stillness that lives directly adjacent to motion. The lead officer made a sound I'd never heard before. I'd heard all the documented Veth enforcement vocalizations in my briefing. This wasn't one of them. Later, the interpretation team would tell me it wasn't in their database either, and that their best construction of it was something like, "I see the territory, requesting passage." Not a command, not a demand, a request. First held for 3 more seconds. Then First made the contact call, the same one from day one, the one that meant established, and the perimeter shifted. Not dissolving, moving, reshaping. The Cubs didn't stand down. They repositioned, maintaining the pattern but opening a channel between the door and my position, so that the officers could approach through a corridor of 8 juveniles who were watching them with the full, patient attention of things that have decided to allow something and could decide otherwise. The enforcement officers walked that corridor in single file. I would like to tell you that the lead officer and I had a meaningful exchange, and that mutual understanding was achieved and everything resolved with grace. What actually happened was that the lead officer reached my position, looked down at me. I was still seated on the floor anchor position, because I was not getting up in the middle of this, and made a sound that the interpretation system rendered as approximately, "You are unexplained." "I know," I said. The negotiation that followed was not the negotiation I had planned. I had planned to argue for supervised transit, for welfare checks, for documentation of the pack bond and its implications for the Cubs' reassignment. What I had not planned for was the lead officer asking to examine First directly and First refusing. Not aggressively, not with threat posture, just a clear, flat refusal to approach the officer without passing through me first, without at some point orienting back to my position in a way that made the nature of the relationship unmistakable. The officers conferred among themselves for a long time. The interpretation system gave me fragments. Unprecedented, protocol does not address, contamination assessment, duration and depth, recommending. Eventually, the lead officer turned back to me. "We are contacting the Accord Council," the interpretation system rendered. "The situation requires classification outside our operational parameters." "How long?" I asked. "Unknown." The Cubs had not moved from their positions during the conference. They had remained in the modified perimeter corridor open, but formation maintained for the entire duration. Not eating, not sleeping, not packing, just holding. War-Caste, bred for it, patient as stones. Eighth had crept back into my peripheral space sometime during the negotiations. Its head was resting not quite on my knee, close enough that I could feel the warmth of it. "All right," I said, "we'll wait." The wait was 4 days. 4 days of Accord communications, of station command fielding messages from both sides of the Accord at volumes that Oral later described to me as unprecedented in tone and unhelpful in content, of the interpretation team working continuously on a situation that had no linguistic framework to work with. I stayed in the hold. I ate there, slept there, short, watchful sleep, the kind you learn in field work, one ear always open. The enforcement officers rotated duty outside the blast door and occasionally inside, in the entrance area, which the Cubs tolerated with a watchful equanimity that I found remarkable. The council's decision arrived on the 4th day, and Oral brought it to me personally. "They've proposed a new classification," he said. "For the Cubs specifically, It doesn't have an existing translation. The interpretation team says the closest rendering is something like cross-bonded ward unit. He paused. There's a provision in Accord treaty law that covers cross-species dependency bonds in survival contexts. It's never been invoked for a human because no human has ever been in this situation before, but the legal structure exists. If you agree to serve as designated human liaison and to complete formal documentation of the bond, the cubs can be reclassified. They're not considered contaminated under this classification. They're considered, and this is the interpretation team's best effort, not an official translation, claimed. I looked at him for a long moment, claimed by me. That's how the interpretation team reads it. And the cubs would remain in a supervised integration program, Oral said, with you present for oversight. Eventually, when they reach adult status, they'd go into whatever role the Accord designates for them. But during development, you'd be involved, formally, legally, as a recognized pack anchor under Accord treaty law. The words sat in the air between us. That's not a small thing, I said. No, Oral agreed, it's genuinely not. I looked back at the hold. First was in the anchor position, had migrated there again, without my noticing, was just there, standing between me and the door in the way that first was always between me and the door. Eighth was somewhere to my left. The others were distributed in the resting watch pattern that had become as familiar to me as the sound of station ventilation. I thought about the moment when I had said stay here and sat down on the floor, and they had formed a perimeter without being asked. I thought about the enforcement officers walking that corridor of 8 war-caste juveniles who had decided to allow it. I thought about the 18 months I had been doing this work, field assignment to field assignment, handling situations that other people found too complicated or too dangerous or too alien to navigate. I thought about what it meant that out of all of those situations, this was the one that had handed me something I hadn't been looking for and couldn't have planned for. All right, I said, get me the documentation. I want to be clear about what did not happen, because people tell the story wrong. I did not choose a dangerous path because I loved them, or because I had some mystical connection with alien predators. I'm a handler. I assess situations and I make pragmatic decisions. And the pragmatic decision on day one was that the only way anyone in that hold was going to survive was if I sat down on the floor and waited. Everything that followed came from that one decision, and the reason I made that decision is not because I was brave or special or chosen. It's because it was the correct move, and I knew how to make it and I made it. What I will say is this: there is a difference between being useful and being necessary, and there is a difference between being tolerated and being pack. I have been in this work long enough to know both of those differences clearly, and I know which one I was to those 8 cubs, and I know it was not something I earned or intended or orchestrated. It was something they decided. That distinction matters to me. The deciding was theirs. On the day the Accord's classification documents were finalized and the enforcement team completed their handover protocol, the lead officer paused at the blast door on the way out. The interpretation system was still running. The officer looked at me for a moment, then at first, then back at me and made a sound. The interpretation system said, "Noted, for the record, that the juvenile pack responded to your commands during the entry engagement." They weren't commands, I said. I told them to stay. They made a choice. The system took a moment on that one. The officer's response came back short and flat, acknowledged, distinction logged. Then the officer left. The months that followed are not mine to summarize cleanly, because they were long and complicated and full of the kind of paperwork that treaty law generates in enormous quantities, and because the cubs' development through that period is not a simple narrative and I am not their story. I am in their story and they are in mine, and those are not the same thing. What I will tell you is this. There was a day, about 4 months after the Accord classification came through, when a separate incident on Kessara, A cargo dispute that escalated into the kind of thing cargo disputes escalate into when people are armed and tired and old grievances are fresh. Put 3 armed individuals between me and a corridor I needed to get through. Not targeted at me. I was simply in the wrong place when things went wrong, which is an occupational hazard of my work. I did not call for them. I didn't have time to. I didn't say anything. What I am told happened. I didn't see it for obvious reasons, is that first came around the corner of that corridor at a velocity that the station security review later described as remarkable for an enclosed space, followed by the other 7, in a configuration that the security officer who reviewed the footage said he had never seen in any tactical training, but which had an elegance to it that he found personally disturbing. The 3 individuals dropped their weapons and put their hands up before anyone was touched. This was the correct response. It is not clear that they understood why they made it, only that something in the situation resolved the question of whether any of this was a good idea very quickly and very completely. When it was over and the security team had arrived and taken the situation in hand, first came to where I was standing and stood beside me, and made the contact call. Established. I put my hand on the back of First's neck, under the collar ridge, a place I had learned, slowly and carefully, was tolerated. Not any place I had initiated. A place First had permitted once, and then continued to permit, in the way that permissions build into something that doesn't need to be named. I know, I said, I know. I am writing this down because someone asked me to. And because the xenobiology records for this incident are thorough on the scientific dimensions but light on the human ones, and because the Accord's classification documentation is thorough on the legal dimensions but light on everything else. Here is what I know, stated plainly for the record. 8 war-caste Veth juveniles arrived at Waypoint Kessara as orphans, wounded, frightened in the way that things bred for war are frightened, not paralyzed but tight-coiled, waiting, assessing. A human woman sat down on a floor and did not run, and they made a decision about her. The decision was not complicated. It was not sentimental. It was the decision that pack animals make about the pack, which is the only decision that matters to them. This one here stays. I told them to stay. They decided I had issued a war command. The difference between those 2 things is everything, and I have spent every day since trying to be worth the difference. That is the whole of it. There is no tidy conclusion, no final victory, no moment where the credits roll. There is a woman who made a choice to sit down and wait, and 8 juveniles who made a choice to form a perimeter, and all of us still here on a cold station at the edge of map space, working out what comes next. The youngest one still sleeps near my knee. I have stopped pretending I mind. There are things I didn't anticipate going into this. Most of them are small. The way the cubs have learned to modulate their movement near me, slowing down in enclosed spaces because they clocked early on that fast movement at close range puts me on alert, even when it's not directed at me. The way First will position itself between me and an open door when I'm distracted with something, not blocking me, just there. The way a person stands when they're keeping a casual eye on a situation. The way 8th has developed a habit of investigating anything I use before I use it, tools, food, new equipment, with the systematic thoroughness of something running a safety check. I did not teach any of this. I observed it accruing. The interpretation team has been working on a more complete vocabulary for the pack vocalizations I've cataloged over these months. Some of it is new ground, sounds the cubs make in the integration context that don't match documented Veth communication in any environment the research has previously accessed. The lead interpreter told me, with the particular expression of someone who finds a problem genuinely interesting and is slightly annoyed about it, that it appears the cubs have been doing something she called pragmatic borrowing. They have been incorporating sound patterns from my voice into their own communication, not mimicking. Making them part of the resonance in ways that function as new signals, shared signals, signals that exist between us specifically, and don't map directly to anything in the existing documentation. She said it in a tone that suggested she wasn't sure whether to be alarmed or fascinated. I suggested she could be both. She said that was unhelpful. I think she was wrong about that. What I'm trying to tell you in all of this is that the situation has continued to evolve in directions I could not have predicted from the beginning and still can't predict from where I'm standing now. Every day is a new data point. Every day the cubs are older, more themselves, more clearly on a developmental trajectory that is not quite the trajectory Accord Protocol intended, and not quite anything the xenobiology literature has a model for. They are, as best as I can describe it, something new, made from what they were born to be and shaped by something that was never supposed to be part of the equation, which is 11 days of a stubborn woman sitting on a floor and refusing to be a threat. I didn't mean to make something new. I meant to treat a wound and keep 8 juveniles alive until someone who knew what to do with them could arrive. The someone who knew what to do with them arrived and went away, and the Accord sent documentation, and the situation became a classification, and the classification became a life, and here we are. I think about the blast door sometimes. The way it opened slowly at minimum speed, the light going low, the moment before I stepped through when the only thing between me and whatever was going to happen was the decision I'd already made. I think about sitting down on the floor and the weight of the quiet in that room, and the 8 pairs of thermal eyes coming to find me in the dark. I didn't know then what they would decide. I hoped. I'd read the literature and I'd made the assessment and I'd concluded the odds were manageable, which is handler language for I thought it might work and I was going to find out. But I didn't know. What I know now is this. The decision you make when you walk into an unknown space and sit down on the floor and stay still, that decision doesn't belong to you alone. You make it, and then something else decides what it means. You offer the stillness and they decide what to do with it. They decided to form a perimeter. I'm still inside it. I expect I will be for a long time, and I have stopped thinking of that as anything other than what it is, which is a life I walked into by accident on a cold station at the edge of the Accord's map space, and which turned out to be the truest thing I've done. Stay here, I said. And here we are.